If you struggle with self-criticism, I'm sure you've wondered to yourself, where does this awful tendency come from? Is it just genetic? Did it start with some sort of awful event from my childhood? Or is it something maybe I'm doing right now in the present that I'm not aware of that's contributing to it? Hi, my name's Nick Wignall. I'm a clinical psychologist and the founder of The Friendly Mind, a free weekly newsletter where I share practical, evidence-based advice for emotional health and resilience. Today, I'm going to answer a question about the origins of self-criticism from a reader of my newsletter who asks, I'm a fairly successful person and generally very kind and supportive with other people in my life, but I have this tendency to get really critical and judgmental of myself. I just don't understand where this impulse to be so mean to myself comes from, especially since I'm not like that with other people. Any insights? All right, so I think there are basically three ways to think about the origins or causes of unhelpful mental habits like self-criticism. The first one is what I would call inherited causes. For a lot of people, this tendency to be self-critical with oneself, it's basically genetic. It's just inherited as part of your personality from your parents. And certain personality types, especially the kind of personality that tends to be a little perfectionistic. Sometimes you can think of these people as strivers or perfectionists, or I think of them often as anxious high achievers. But essentially, they're people who have a very clear idea of how things should be, and then also feel strongly that they need to close the gap. And it's almost painful to them that things are not as they should be, right? So they end up being very hardworking, very achievement-oriented, very goal-focused, and frankly, very successful in a lot of areas of life. But the flip side of that sort of personality coin is often that they have this tendency to be overly harsh and judgmental and critical with themselves. So I say that because it's important to acknowledge that while you can improve this tendency to be critical with yourself, you are never going to eradicate it, especially if you're the type of person who just, based on your temperament or inherited personality, tend that way. Now, the second thing is there are often learned causes to mental habits like self-criticism. The biggest one in this case is almost always some form of parental modeling. So your parents or just some sort of important caregiver in your life at an early stage probably, even if they weren't aware of it, verbalized a lot of their own self-criticism. So they would say things like, I'm such a screw up, how could I do that? All the different forms of self-criticism. And again, they probably weren't doing this intentionally. They maybe weren't even aware that they did it, that they verbalized out loud their own self-criticism. But as a little kid, if you were around that, like most things in childhood, we soak it up like a sponge. So that is another cause or origin of self-criticism. We often learn to criticize ourselves because we see people in our lives criticizing themselves. But the thing is, both of these causes, your inherited causes and your learned causes from childhood, the thing is there's not much you can do about either of those. So while it's important to acknowledge those and that they exert some effect on your habits in the present, in this case, the habit of self-criticism, what's most helpful to focus on are what I call the maintaining causes. A maintaining cause is something that's going on in the present, usually something you're doing, even if you're not aware of it, that is contributing to and maintaining or even exacerbating and making worse this habit of self-criticism. Now, the way I like to think about really any kind of bad habit, either an external behavior or an internal habit like self-criticism, a really helpful way to think about these is with a framework psychologists call functional analysis. Functional analysis means that usually the most productive way to look at unhelpful patterns or behaviors, instead of thinking of them as bad things you need to get rid of, like self-criticism, it's this bad thing I need to get rid of. Ask yourself, what function does it serve? What job is it doing? Because almost always, if you have a habit that's persisting, that's sticking around, it's because on some level, whether you realize it or not, you're getting something out of it. It's doing a job. And often there's some need, some psychological or emotional need inside of you, and self-criticism has become a way that you have learned to address that need. Now, with most bad habits, self-criticism included, the long-term costs are probably not worth whatever kind of benefit you're getting. So the way to think about undoing self-criticism is to ask yourself, okay, what need is self-criticism addressing or serving? And is there a better, healthier way to get that need met? And if you do that, you will essentially put your self-criticism out of a job because it won't be needed anymore. So you don't have to get rid of self-criticism. It will sort of melt away as a result of addressing this need in a more helpful way. So what could that look like? What are some of those needs? There's all sorts of psychological needs that something like self-criticism could address. But I'll give you 2 examples of common ones that I see a lot. The first one is self-criticism can function as a way of distracting from the emotion of regret. So when you make a mistake or you think back on a mistake or an error or a failure in your life, it's very normal to feel the emotion of regret. It's kind of this mixture of sadness and guilt. You feel bad about a mistake you've made. Now, the thing is, just because regret feels bad doesn't mean it is bad. But our tendency is, as soon as we feel bad, including feeling regretful, we immediately try to do something to not feel that way anymore. And a lot of people, especially these kind of perfectionistic or anxious high achievers, they learn to use self-criticism as a way to distract from the pain of regret. So they go up into their head and start criticizing themselves, which is a mental habit, as a way to get out of the feeling of regret. Of course, this only works in a very brief, superficial sense. It temporarily distracts from the regret, but ultimately it just leads to actually a lot more shame, sadness, regret, self-directed anger, all those things that come as a result of self-criticism. Another really common function that self-criticism can serve is to alleviate the anxiety or fear of failure. So as this kind of perfectionistic, anxious high achiever or striver, you probably struggle with some fear of failure. It's a very common thing for this type of person. And again, like regret, anxiety, that fear you feel around failure, it's really uncomfortable. So our natural reaction is to get rid of it, to do something to either get rid of it or distract ourselves from it. And a lot of people fall into the habit of self-criticism precisely because it feels productive. Superficially, it looks a lot like problem solving. You're thinking about the mistake and what you did wrong and what you could have done differently. All of that feels productive. It gives you something to do that temporarily gets you out of the emotion, the raw emotion of fear or anxiety. But just like using self-criticism to distract from regret, when you use it to distract from the anxiety, you're only dealing with the anxiety in a very superficial sense. It's really kind of an illusion. You're not actually dealing with the anxiety at all. You're just ignoring it or distracting yourself from it. It's an illusion that self-criticism is productive. There are productive, non-judgmental ways to be critical of yourself and reflect on mistakes and learn from them. But self-criticism tends to be unproductive and just leads to a lot more downsides than upsides, right? So let's say you find yourself in this scenario where you think your self-criticism is being maintained in large part by this function of addressing your fear of failure. It helps you alleviate temporarily that anxiety you feel when you consider even failing or being a disappointment to other people. Well, so what do we do with that? Well, once you know that, the question then becomes, what's a healthier way to deal with the fear of failure, to deal with my anxiety about failing? I think I'll give you 2 quick ideas here for this. The first is look for other examples of anxiety in your life, smaller, easier to handle examples of anxiety. Situations where you get a little bit anxious, but really it's not very problematic. It's the type of thing where normally you wouldn't even think much about it. You just feel a little bit anxious. Instead of just disregarding those, use those as opportunities to practice tolerating anxiety and being willing to have it. Because that's the secret. If you don't want to have to need self-criticism to get out of anxiety, what you want to do instead is to build up your capacity to tolerate and be willing to have your anxiety and get on with life anyway. And that skill you can start to build simply by noticing very small moments of anxiety in your life and saying, all right, I feel anxious. I'm not going to try and distract myself. I'm just going to get on with life, being willing to have that anxiety at the same time. So that's the first way. Practice on small bits of anxiety. Practice tolerating anxiety in very small bits, and then slowly work your way up to these bigger moments of intense fear of failure. The second way is through a really cool, powerful exercise. It's a little counterintuitive, but it's so helpful. It's called scheduled worry. The gist of it is by making time every day to worry on purpose, you are confronting and approaching your worries and the anxiety that come with them instead of continuing to fall in this habit of avoiding your anxieties and worries, which is ultimately what makes them so hard to handle. So scheduled worry just involves making time to worry on purpose for a fixed amount of time every day. And it turns out when you get in the habit of doing this regularly, your brain desensitizes to anxiety. It stops being anxious about being anxious. And that really is the big problem with any kind of anxiety, including fear of failure, is that you're not just afraid of failing. What you're really afraid of is the anxiety that comes with imagining that you might fail. And you can, again, desensitize yourself to that second layer of anxiety by deliberately approaching worry and anxiety instead of running away from them. If you want more information on scheduled worry, you can go to scheduledworry.com. It's this small little webpage that I maintain, and it gives you instructions on how to do it. There's a little guide you can download. I would really recommend checking that out. It's super helpful. Go check that one out. Thanks for tuning in. As usual, if you've enjoyed my answer to this question, you can ask me any question you would like about emotional health and well-being by joining my free weekly newsletter, The Friendly Mind. There's a link in the description below. It takes 10 seconds. You can sign up really quickly. It's totally free. And I would love to have you as a part of our little community. Cheers.